All right, the next thing I want to go over is a little bit of hands-on. Again, we're going to be using these computers or your computers. So what I'd like you to do at this point is open up, and I know everybody has a couple different things happening here. Some of you have Macs, some have, the PCs, their own laptops, and some are using machines here in class. So we'll do the easy thing first. Open up at least 2 browsers. Doesn't matter which ones, but at least 2. You should probably have 2. I think most of you will have at least 2. Now, if you do not have at least 2, I'm going to recommend that you install, 2 more. You already have 1, and then pick 2 others to install on your machine. So if you're using an Apple machine, you probably have Safari. I'm going to suggest you install Firefox and Chrome. If you have Windows, you already have IE, so I would then install Chrome and Firefox. And these machines have 5, the ones that we provide you. It has Firefox, it has Chrome, it has Opera, it has Safari, it has IE, and I believe that's it. Yeah, right? Now, you don't have to install it tonight and right now if you only have 1. Just know that you should, because I will be checking your work in multiple browsers to make sure that it looks good. Okay? So for now, if you only have 1, then open up the 1. If you have more than 1, open up at least 2. Okay. Great. We're going to do a little bit of hands-on, so let's get to what I want, and that is the next thing I'd like you to open. And again, this is based on your operating system. If you're using a Windows machine, I want you to open up Notepad. Notepad, not Notepad++ if you're using one of these computers here at Harper. You most likely will not have Notepad++ if you have your own laptop. Okay. Notepad, yes, it is a very basic application. It looks very similar to what I have on my screen. Right? It looks like a little notepad, the icon for that application. So in a Windows machine, you will look for Notepad. If you are on an Apple machine or a Mac, you will open TextEdit. Now, for you Mac users, you'll have to do a little bit of editing to the preferences of TextEdit for us to actually use the text editor as a HTML editor, as a real valid text editor that just does text and doesn't do rich text format, which essentially is whatever you type, it gets wrapped in HTML, and we don't want that. We just want strictly text, right? So there are some settings. In Blackboard, in Module 1, there is a link to the Mac settings. You have to go to the preferences, and there's a couple options, okay? If you haven't done that already, okay, I would recommend now go to Blackboard, click the link, and follow those steps. Okay. I'll give you a moment to do so. All right, so now you have Notepad open, and you have, or TextEdit, depending on the browser or the OS you're using. And then you have a browser open, okay? And perhaps it's empty. You might have a new tab. It doesn't matter at this point, just so you have at least one of them open. I'm going to go ahead and maximize the window at this point. Now, if you're using Notepad, one of the nice things that Notepad provides is the ability to actually change the size of text and the font that you're using. So we'll do this in just a moment. Once we start to type a few things, we'll get to see how big the content is by default. And sometimes you might want to increase the size because it's just a little too small typically. Okay? All right, so in Chapter 1, at the end of the chapter, it's actually showing you how to build the basis of every single HTML page we are going to create in this class. Okay? And there are pretty much like 3, 4, 5 mandatory elements, we call those, okay, that we need. Who can tell me what the first one is that we need? What is the first element? Huh? I thought I heard it. I heard doc type. That's the first thing we're going to put in our code. So what I want you to do is go ahead and let's type doc type. Okay? And there's a few other stuff we have to add in there. Okay? So let me go ahead and just real quick here. Get that out of here. Now, doc type here is in uppercase. It's okay to put it in lowercase. Okay? The book sometimes has it in uppercase only because it's easier to read. But HTML5 says you do not have to have it uppercase. In fact, they want you to do it in lowercase. But in this case, the validator will not give you an error if you have doc type in uppercase. It might just give you a warning and say, hey, just so you know, you don't have to put it in uppercase. Okay? So this is the first element that we need in our page for it to be HTML. Okay? In this case, even further, HTML5. So after the doc type, okay, what this says is when the browser hits this page, it's going to look for the document type. What type of document am I about to get, right? Well, anything after the word doc type defines what version of HTML, right? The browser should know that we are about to provide them. And so just by typing the word HTML, we're telling the browser that we're about to provide them with HTML5 code. So now the browser says, thank you very much. Now I can do whatever I need to make sure that I display HTML5 correctly. Right? So if you're using an older version, XHTML or HTML4, well then that's a whole other set of, right, text and words and numbers that you'll have to use. In this class, we're using HTML5, so that's the only thing you need to type. Does that make sense? Sweet. All right. The next line that we need to type in there is our HTML element. Keep a line in between the opening and the closing HTML tags. So I'll give you a moment to type that in. And here's that thing that I mentioned about Notepad in a Windows environment, that if I'd like to change the font size, I can, or the font and the font style to make it bigger. So if you're having a hard time reading it, simply go to the Format menu and choose font or format, or what is it, font. Okay. My recommendation, if you decide to change the font, is to change it to a no serif font. Something like Arial is a good choice. The reason is some fonts, the L's and the I's and the ones all look the same. So we want to be able to distinguish these types of characters. All right, the next element we have is HTML. Okay, this is mandatory. We need it, and it comes after doc type, and it is paired. That means it has an opening and a closing. So start HTML and then end HTML. So it's simply saying the HTML starts here, the HTML ends here. We're done. There's nothing after HTML. Nothing goes after the closing HTML tag. And notice how the closing one has a /. So whenever we have an element that is paired, that it's got an opening and a closing tag, you always use the / to indicate that you are now done with that particular tag. Okay? We start it and then we close it. Great. Now, the next thing I want you to type is the head. Ignore the title and the meta for now. Go ahead and just type head. And give yourself a couple of lines in between. Now you'll notice that I tabbed in. I used the tab key to push the head tag, right, or element over a bit. So I can start seeing a little bit of structure, right? Where the head is actually inside of the HTML tag, right? This is going to be important for us later because we're going to have a lot more elements and it's going to be a lot more difficult to read if we don't structure our code in some way. If you code everything on the left-hand side of the page, you'll end up pulling out your hair because it's very difficult to see where something starts and something ends. Does that make sense? All right. The head element. Anything that goes in the head element, okay, either describes the web page or is used and the user does not see it. Okay? It's information that the web page needs, but the user doesn't see it. Okay? We'll fill this with a few things. So we'll just go with that for now. One of the things we're going to fill it with is called a title element. So go ahead and put in the title element. It is a paired tag, but this time I didn't put the closing tag on a separate line. I just put it at the end. This is typical. Because usually the title isn't that long. Just got a couple of words or so in it. Okay. Now, the next line that is going to be within the head element is called a meta element. The meta element is simply a generic tag that allows us to do a lot of things. Okay? Define the author of the page, define what type of character set we're using. There are lots of meta data out there. So it is a generic element that allows us to identify different characteristics about this particular page. Okay? All right, we're going to use what's called an attribute in this particular element. An attribute defines the element we're using. So we're using a meta element, which is generic, but then by using character set, we're essentially defining how we want to use that element. Think of it as properties. It describes the element for us, okay? So we're going to use character set equals UTF-8, okay? There are many character sets out there, okay? A lot of character sets. So if you want the character set for a different language, right, with different symbols, like Chinese or whatever it may be, well, then your character set may be a little different, right? Now, did you also notice we used a attribute in the HTML element? Yeah, what do you think that one stands for? Fantastic, right? Lang simply stands for language, equals, and then EN, English. Did you notice that both attributes have a syntax about them? That is, they define the name of the attribute, which is then followed by what? An equal sign and quotes. So whenever you have an attribute, it will always follow, there's no exception, always follow the equal sign and then quotes, and then the value is going to be in between the quotes. So whatever it equals to is inside the quotes. Okay? All right. We'll be using these quite often. So we got 2 of them so far. All right, so we're done at this point with the head element. So underneath the head element, we're going to add in the body element. So go ahead just for now, just put in the body, opening and closing tags. If you would, please tab them in similar to head. As you can see, they're inside of HTML, but a brand new element. So think of these as levels, right? So at the farthest, right, the topmost level, we have HTML, and then within HTML, you got head and body, and then within head, you have 2 more, and then within the body, well, we'll have a whole bunch of stuff. For now, go ahead and just type in what you'd like. A sentence, a couple of words, up to you. I mean, if you want to type in hello world, that's fine too. Great. Now that you've done that, I want you to save the file. But let's follow me up here, because if you haven't saved something in Notepad before, or perhaps text editor, it's not just a one click. There's a couple things we need to do just to make sure. Or maybe I didn't click it. Let's do a save as. Great. Now, save this where you might find it easy. I'm going to save it on the desktop. So I chose desktop in a Windows environment. If you're using a Mac environment, well then find the desktop or whatever the equivalent is. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to fill in the name of the file. We're going to call this index.html. Index is considered the home page for every website. So when we go to a website, even though you don't type it in, and you go to google.com, it's actually presenting you with a file called index.html. Most likely. This is a very, very common and the default file name of home pages. Okay. All right, now that you've given it a name, what's the most important here is the type of file. By default, in the Notepad, it says it wants to save it as a .txt. What does this mean? It means that if we left it as is, we would get a file that says index.html.txt. And it would not be an HTML file, which you can open in a browser. It has to be a .html file for us in this class. Okay? All right, HTML files have an extension of HTML. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop down that menu and choose all files. By choosing all files, it allows us to give our own extension, which we already have done, .html. Yeah, Morgan. Great. Go ahead and choose that and see if it pre-populates, right, your file name with the .html. Because what we don't want is it to be index.html.html. We'll have to get rid of one of the HTMLs. So we're good? Okay, and so it's not displaying the extension then. Perfect then, we're good. Now, look at the address bar at the top, and does it say all right, so Morgan, in your browser, look at the address bar, and you'll probably see the path to where that file exists. Does it say index.html? Perfect, then you're good. Nice job. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit save or press save. And now what you should see is that your Notepad or text editor should have the file name at the top somewhere. The next thing I want to do is I want to go to that browser that I asked you to open. Now, if you already had one open, then give me a new tab, and there's usually a little button up where the tabs are. And then we're going to open up that index file from wherever you saved it. Now, what's interesting about more recent browsers, they've removed by default the menu bar, right? So if I wanted to open something, you got to go and click someplace else to try to figure out how do I get that menu bar, or you press the Alt key to bring up the menu bar. However, I like keyboard shortcuts, and typically Control-O opens the dialog box for you to open a file, like if you were in some other application like Word or Excel or some other program. So now, locate wherever you decided to save that index file. I decided to put it on my desktop. There it is. I've selected it. And once you've selected it, go ahead and either press open or double click on it, one of the two. And now you are looking at the web page you just created. This is the basics right here. Every web page going forward will have the code we just typed in. the elements, right? The content will be a little different. Not all of our web pages are going to say hello world, okay? Now, I want you to notice something else. The tab that you have in your browser, what does it say? Does it say anything? The title. So if in your notepad you typed in my first HTML5 web page between the title tags, then it will display on the tab of that browser. All right, do me a favor. Go back to your notepad, and I want you to change two things. The content of the title and the content of the body. Put something else in there. So both the content of the title and the content of the body. You're going to change them both. Then, save the file. Again, you don't have to rename it. Just hit save. Since you've already saved once, you don't have to give it a name again. Then, flip-flop to the browser, and then refresh the browser. And you might be saying, how do I do that? You have a couple of options. If you're a keyboard person like I am, F5 will refresh the browser. It will, and what that means, refresh, it will go locate the file that you had and just bring up a new copy of it. That's essentially what it's doing, right? It'll just make sure that what the browser is displaying is the most current version. The other option is to look for a little, like a couple of arrows going in a circle, or at least one. And the browser that I currently have up, if you look on the right-hand side, underneath the tab, there's a little arrow that kind of goes to the right. That's the refresh button. Okay? Press that, and now you should see a change in the browser. Good. That's what we'll be doing going forward. We'll open up Notepad, we'll do some coding, we'll save it, we'll go to the browser, we'll refresh, we'll see what we've done, and if the changes we've made look good, we'll jump back into Notepad, we'll make some more changes, we'll save it, we'll jump back to the browser, and we'll continue back and forth adding and editing and adding some really cool stuff. Now, please open that that index.html file in another browser, please. Your choice. I'm going to do the same. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to put these side by side. So I'm going to start to close some of the things that are here and then reopen these. And what I'd like you to do is, in your own screen as well, I want you to compare the two windows. So you may have to resize the browser window so you can see both of them at the same time. Do you see any differences between the words on that screen? That is, anything that's in the white space. So I have Hello World and another browser that says the same thing. Is there a difference between those two? Okay, in your two browsers that you're using, not much probably. Mine don't really look that different. Maybe a little bit. That one seems to be maybe a little bit more heavy, while that one's a little bit less. But the changes are very minute. So, Nicholas, you said the changes were substantial? The color's a little bit different? Yeah. So, what I'm trying to show you is that each browser may display the content just a little different. They shouldn't display them drastically where something's on the left-hand side in one browser and on the right-hand side of the other. That means that maybe the code's not quite right, or, there's something wrong with the browser itself. Because this day and age, the browsers that are being developed now, right, updates that are being posted, most of the browsers display the content, at least the content that we'll be developing in this class, pretty much the same. But little minute changes or differences. Okay? Any questions? questions.